Hello and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS as part of your World History course. Today we'll be discussing the first module, which is the American Revolution. The American Revolution was one of the most significant events in world history because it introduced certain concepts such as democracy, the concept of no taxation without representation. More than that, it was the first revolution which happened against colonialism. So, when we talk about the American Revolution itself, it is a very significant event in the larger context of the world because democracy as a word, the concept of liberty, the concept of freedom, all became a part of the vocabulary of the world through this event. More than that, it is also the first event where we see that economic nationalism was at the forefront. Nationalism as a concept is very, very important. And when we will see the next unit, which is the French Revolution, would be the political nationalism movement, economic nationalism became the founding stone for all forms of nationalism in the larger context. So, when we try to understand the American Revolution, we need a starting point. The starting point is actually the discovery of the New World, which happened in 1492. However, there's a problem. I can't start at 1492, which is the discovery of the New World, without telling you the backstory and going back to the 14th or 15th century, because you can only understand why the New World was found when you try to understand the larger context of the events which were happening around it. So, when we talk about the world itself, generally it was believed that there's the old world, which is Europe itself. Then you have the Orient, which is nothing but Asia and specifically India and China. You have Africa. But nobody knew what was across the Atlantic. The fact of the matter was that everybody was going around in the Indian Ocean, in and around that area, but nobody in Europe imagined what was across the Atlantic. And that is why when we look at the nomenclature which they used the word called New World. The word New World is important. Why? Because for them it was new. One thing should be clear in your mind very straight away. It was not a new world. They call it the New World, but they were already Chalcolithic, Neolithic, and even proper civilizations such as the Aztecs and Inca in America. So one thing should be clear that they call it the New World, the colonization of the New World, but that world was not new. It was new to the European because history is generally Eurocentric. It talks about the European perspective. For the Europeans, the world was new, but there were already civilizations and inhabitants there. So this should be totally clear in your mind that though we use the nomenclature called New World, it should not be confused with the fact that it was something totally nascent. There was nothing there. There were proper civilizations, very, very civilized and very sophisticated civilizations, such as the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans. They were quite sophisticated. Not as technologically advanced as Europe. However, they were quite sophisticated and quite developed in that regard. So, what we do is that we start our story not in 1492, but we have to reach 1492, but we go back in time. When we go back in time, we will try to understand why did the New World be discovered? Meaning, why was that discovery became important? Why and how people got the guts to cross the Atlantics? Why is that they actually thought that there was something across the Atlantic? The point of the matter is, why was that now navigators were ready to cross over to the New World? For that, we need to start a little bit early. First, we need to understand the 13th and 14th century. 13th and 14th century is important. Why? Because this period is the period of decline of feudalism. First, let's try to understand what is feudalism itself. So, feudalism is a pyramidal structure of society and polity. In this, you have the king at the apex, who has a very, very close relationship with the church, and will quantify the influence of the church over the king itself, thereby telling you how it was the losing of the grip of the church over the king and education system and society, which allowed for these changes in the larger context. So the church and the king had a very good nexus. The divine authority came from the church itself. Here, the power of the church is 100%. It has everything. It is controlling education. It is controlling society. It is controlling everything, and it has a specific narrative of the world. Under the king, who is at the apex, you have the knights, who are nothing but the soldiers and sometimes also called nobles. They are both in a relationship of understanding in which they are having a reciprocal relationship with the king. It is a decentralized system. The king only controls the knights and nobles. Under the knights and nobles, we have the vassals, or what we call as landlords. And under the landlords, we have what are called the serfs, or the bonded labor. So the concept is very, very simple. The king controls the knights and nobles. The knights and nobles control the vassals, and the vassals control the serfs and the bonded labor. This is what is called a feudal structure. For sometimes you will see a fourfold in which knight noble would be distinguished, but it is the same thing. The fact of the matter is you have a nobility, which is also the fighting class, could also be related to the king. The point is the main factor of production, or the production, was happening via the serfs and the bonded labor. Now, the point which you need to understand in the larger context here is, here the church authority is at 100%. It is at the highest when it comes to controlling everything. So, the narrative which the generic concept which the church created was that the earth is flat, that there is an edge to the earth. So as of 13th, 14th century, nobody would go too far into the sea because they thought that they will fall down from the earth itself. They believed that the earth is flat and there's a hemispherical dome in which the sun and the moon go around. The center of the universe was the earth. Thereby, the universe itself revolved around the flat earth. Now, this flat earth concept is very, very important. Why? Because this meant that discovery or voyages were the least, and nobody wanted to go too far out in the sea or in the ocean. Therefore, in 13th and 14th century, the church control is so much that the general education system and the society believes that the earth is flat. Therefore, nobody wanted to go too far off into the Atlantic, so nobody could cross the Atlantic itself. So that is why everything revolved around being close to the coast. That is why they used to go to coast in Africa, then go into the Indian Ocean, and thereby to India. So when we talk about the feudal structure, it is a very, very decentralized, but a way in which the church control over king, over bonded labor. The church is its parallel system itself, a parallel state itself. However, something changes. What changes is that by the end of 13th and the beginning of the 14th century, feudalism was declining, and what we see is the rise of absolutism, which is called absolutist monarchy. In this, what happens is that the king usurps the power away from the church, and he says that God does not give me power, I am the divine power on earth itself. Thereby, he starts to appropriate power, and this appropriation of power in turn leads to what is called the absolutist monarchy. An absolutist monarchy is very, very important because this reduces the power of the church. And this is very significant because now the church authority goes down significantly from 100% to 80%. We are quantifying it for your understanding. The fact of the matter is this 20% hold over the king was very, very important. So with the rise of absolutist monarchy, what happens is that the church authority goes down, thereby creating the context in which now we have a series of events which will happen, which will change the course of history itself. So the first is the rise of the absolutist monarchy, which allows for the king to appropriate power, and with the appropriation of power, the church gets marginalized. However, the most important impact of rise of absolutism and generally the church authority going down is called the Renaissance. The Renaissance is very, very important because it is a cultural movement, and this cultural movement, which started in the Italian city-states, was very, very important. What was the concept was that with the church authority going away, this 20% gave the space for the revivalism of what is called Greek mythology and Greek sciences. They realized that the Greeks had already thought about the earth, they already had an understanding of philosophy, and this revival of the Greek mythology also meant that now the challenge for church authority was ready. The fact of the matter is that Greek mythology, rather than concentrating on God, concentrated on the individual. So rather than going in too much detail about the Renaissance itself, which is technically out of the syllabus itself, what you need to understand is Renaissance gives rise to two things, which is a cultural movement. Renaissance itself means resurgence. The cultural movements of the Renaissance is very, very important because it gives rise to what is called the concept of individualism and humanism. What the Renaissance argues is that the church has an obsession with the divine, but the divine is not here. The individual is important. And thereby, Da Vinci, Michelangelo started to paint about humans. Humans became important. And the concept that it is divine power which gives everybody life. However, it is man who changes everything. So this humanism, this individualism became a major challenge to the church because the church authority was taken away. So this 20% shift allowed for two things, which is individualism and humanism. Individualism directly challenged the earth church's authority, but at the same time, what it challenged was scholasticism. Scholasticism is the church's education system. And this education system is concentrating more on philosophy, the understanding of what is called theology, the understanding of God. It is more about religious studies. That is called scholasticism. And it was taught in colleges, it was taught in schools. Everything was controlled by the church. However, humanism challenged the education system of scholasticism. And that is why most of our new subjects, which are called history, political science, sociology, anthropology, are called humanities because they come out of the concept of humanism. So, what humanism did was that it challenged scholasticism. And now, in the educational sphere, the humanistic studies allowed for what is called the rise of secular subjects, and specifically the history of man, the history of the state, anthropology, and the concept of economics. Everything is going to rise here. So this will, what it will do is it will further reduce the control of the church over education system. So if for 80%, it will become 60%. So the control of the church over education will take away another 20% of the control of the church over education system and the people, which allows for the society to think in a secular way. And this in turn will then create the context for the second major event. The Renaissance, humanism, individualism will lead to the second most important event, which is called the Reformation. The Reformation, which we also call as the rise of Protestant religion, was a major challenge. It came from Martin Luther. So with the general understanding of the church and its general hold on education going away, now the challenge came from within, where Martin Luther was very, very frustrated with the concept of the corruption in the church itself. The papacy, which is nothing but the church's bureaucracy, was fully corrupt. The archbishop, bishop, the higher ranking clergy were very, very rich. On the other hand, the priests were very, very poor, poverty stricken. And more than that, Martin Luther was very frustrated with the concept of sale of indulgences. What do you mean by sale of indulgences? That you do a sin and you go to the church, you say that I've sinned, you give them money, they give you a certificate saying that your sin has been taken away. And he became extremely frustrated by the concept of this sale of indulgences, thereby then nailing his 99 thesis on the church wall and the door, thereby creating the context in which there is a rise of what is called the Protestant ethic and the Protestant religion, and the church's control over what is called Christianity will go away. And now we will have two types of Christianity: Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians. They were within the same fold of Christianity, but their understanding of how to conduct oneself was different. With the rise of Martin Luther In France will come Calvin. Then in England, we will see the church authority taken away by the crown itself, thereby creating the context for the rise of the Anglican Church, in which the King of Britain itself assumes the power of a religious leader. So here, the queen or the king were both the religious and the political leader, thereby creating the context for the Anglican Church. So what we see is all across Europe, we will see a certain challenge which will be mounted by the churches and these Protestant thinkers and leaders against the Catholic Christian Church. Thereby, what will happen is the further diminishing power of the church from 60% to 40%. And this 40% is very, very important because it will create. So from Renaissance, we challenged the church's education system, scholasticism, and talked about the man, to the Reformation. We don't have to go into too much detail because these are very subsidiary events. When we talk about the Reformation itself, there will be a challenge from within where Martin Luther will challenge the church itself. Catholic and Protestant religions will rise. Protestants will then challenge the conduct of the priests, and there will be a new type of church which will rise. And what is ironic is that in the Reformation, what the Protestant church did in their schools or the Sunday schools, humanistic studies was taught. So now the diminishing authority of the church is such that now it has no real control over the society and the education system, which in turn created the context for the rise of the third most important concept, or the rise of modern sciences, or what we call as the scientific revolution. With the rise of the concept of humanistic studies, there was space for now the scientists to argue, Kepler, Galileo, to prove that Earth is not the center of the universe, but the sun is, and the Earth is revolving around the sun. The fact that the Earth was a geoid, it was not flat. What Kepler, what Galileo, what Newton did was argued that everything does not work with divine law, but there are natural laws. Newton's three laws, what it did was it argued that there are natural laws which are independent of the divine power, thereby creating the context in which now there can be an argument that the church's understanding of the general earth structure and its science is totally wrong. And now you can automatically create a link that with this we will have the age of discovery. This age of discovery is important. Why? Because if it was not for the Renaissance or the Reformation or the scientific revolution, the voyagers, and specifically funded by the Portuguese and the Spanish, would never dare to cross the Atlantic. So what we see is that the age of discovery was a product of the larger context of the changes which were happening in Europe. So when you look at these events, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the age of revolution, scientific and commercial, and enlightenment, which in between you have what is called the age of discovery, we see that there will be a major shift in the understanding of the world. The enlightenment is also important, 18th century event. This was where the concept of liberty, Rousseau, Voltaire, Kant started to argue, and we'll talk about this further when we go forward. These thinkers now argued about a democratic state. They talked about social justice. They talked about civil rights and the church's authority over the king. Everything was challenged. So these events, from Renaissance, Reformation, to the scientific, to the age of discovery, to enlightenment, is the context in which we need to understand world history. All this context is important. Why? Because you can't understand that why in 1492 the king will be funding voyages across the ocean. So when we look at the discovery of the New World in 1492, October 12th, where Columbus will reach the Bahamas, and after that 1493 there will be a proper process of colonization of the New World. The fact of the matter was that Spanish and the Portuguese were quite enthusiastic in sending the ships across to the Atlantic. More than that, royal patronage was very, very important because it was a very expensive thing to go across the Atlantic. But remember, the Renaissance, then the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the age of discovery, and the enlightenment. Specifically, these 3-4 events are very, very important because they created the context in which the voyagers such as Christopher Columbus were ready to cross the Atlantic. Remember this point, that the church's control over the king was the problem. Their conception was a problem, thereby creating the context for a very regressive form of scientific knowledge. And once the church's authority goes away, in the sequence of these events, that allows for the age of discovery to begin. And therein where lies our story, which is the American Revolution, because America as a continent was found in this process. So when you look at the general voyages, you don't have to learn any of this, but from Portugal and Spain, a lot of different voyages happened. Columbus, two times Cortes. You have the different people coming from the Italian city states also. A more important point, Cabot. Cabot was the only person from Britain who crossed over. But the most important was Magellan. What Magellan did was that he proved that the earth was round. He circumvented the earth and argued and showed that the earth was round, and the conception that the earth was flat was now challenged. What is ironic is today still people believe in the flat earth concept, but it was conclusively proven that the earth was round and there was no edge of the earth. And these voyages are very, very important because they now create the context in which the new world was found. So, before we move to America itself and understand the British colonies, you need to understand two, three things here totally clearly. First and foremost thing is that the Renaissance, Reformation, Scientific Revolution, Age of Discovery are connected. You need to start where feudalism was, how absolutist monarchy takes away the authority of the church, that allows for the Renaissance to happen in the Italian city states, which talks about individualism, individual, thereby creates the context in which we see the rise of what is called the scientific revolution and the Reformation. Reformation is the internal coup, the internal destruction of the concept of sale of indulgences, the frustration of the lower clergy, whereby Luther, Calvin, Anglican churches now created the context in which humanistic studies could be taught, that created the context and the space in which scientists such as Kepler, Galileo, and even Newton were able to show that there is something called science, there is something called natural law, and the earth is not center of the universe, it is not flat, and thereby in turn creating the context in which the age of discovery will begin. And we are in that age of discovery. So our story starts in 1492 when Columbus reaches back and says that there's something across the Atlantic, and Magellan has already proven that the earth is now round. And we will begin and concentrate. See, in the New World, you have the Spanish, you have the Portuguese, you have the French, you have the British. But because all history which we read is British centric and the American Revolution will happen in the British colonies, we will now start to concentrate on the British colonies and understand them in that context.